Hi, this is Mike Gant, and today is Saturday, September the 10th, and today we'll complete the teaching of my review of Matthew Vine's video, which he calls I Think God and the Gay Christian. And so I've been spending the last 4 weeks plus this one reviewing just the introduction. It's a little over an hour, the entire video, an hour and 7 minutes and 18 seconds. But all we're going to review are the first 16 minutes and 45 seconds where he gives the introduction. And we've done all of that except we just have 1 minute left. So let me play that now. I have to turn the phone around again.
This is a major problem. By holding to the traditional interpretation, we are now contradicting the Bible's own teachings. The Bible teaches that it is not good for the man to be forced to be alone, and yet now we are teaching that it is. Scripture says that good teachings will bear good fruit, but now the reverse is occurring, and we say it's not a problem. Something here is off. Something is out of place. And it's because of these problems and these contradictions that more and more Christians have been going back to Scripture and re-examining the 6 verses that have formed the basis for an absolute condemnation of same-sex relationships. Can we go back? Can we take a closer look at these verses and see what we can learn from further study of them? What are these 6 verses? There are 3 in the Old Testament and 3 in the New Testament. So I'll go in order of their periods in Scripture.
Okay, so that's all we're going to see of the video. That was his introduction, all the setup to now he's going to talk about these six verses. So just before he mentioned the 6 verses, he was reviewing what we covered last week and the week before, which was, I think the way he framed it was, even before we get to these 6 verses, we've already found 2 major problems with this point of view, the traditional teaching, he calls it, the traditional interpretation of the Scripture. And one is that he says it violates the Sermon on the Mount. Well, that's pretty fundamental, if it violates the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount is the longest single discourse of Jesus in the entire New Testament. It comes near the beginning of Matthew, which is the first book in the New Testament. It is the teaching with which Jesus is obviously closely associated with in the minds of most people who know anything at all about him. So his charge that the traditional teaching violates the Sermon on the Mount is not just an introductory matter. I mean, that's a huge, huge issue. But he doesn't argue the case. He just declares it. He doesn't defend his assertion. He's asserting that the traditional interpretation violates the Sermon on the Mount, and to the degree that he does justify, which is very little, he's saying that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, a good teaching brings forth good fruit, or a good tree brings forth good fruit, a bad tree brings forth bad fruit, which Matthew interprets to mean a good teaching will make people feel good, and a bad teaching will make people feel bad. Well, that is thoroughly off base. There's no promise in the Bible that God's teachings will make us feel good. They ultimately lead to our good all the time, but God is telling us that we're sinners. That does not feel good. God is reminding us of how we have fallen short of His glory. The initial experience of that does not feel good. So, and not only that, Matthew doesn't even follow his own teaching, because what he's saying is, you're making me feel bad because you're teaching that homosexuality is bad, and that's what I am, at least that's what I think I am, and you're making me feel bad because you're telling me that's bad. But what he's doing in reverse is he's trying to make you feel bad for thinking that about him. So he thinks it's a bad idea. Any teaching that causes someone to feel bad is a bad teaching, except when it's something he's teaching. What he's teaching is that everyone who thinks homosexuality is a sin, he wants them to feel bad for thinking that. He wants them to feel like that's wrong. So he's not even practicing what he preaches. But the more fundamental thing is he's taken a very anti-biblical approach, yet doing it in the name of the Bible. And then the second problem he identifies before he gets to his 6 verses are that it goes against Genesis 1 and 2, which is the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, the very foundation of all the scriptures. So I mean, he's really got a 1-2 punch going here in his quote introduction. And here he's saying it's not good for man to be alone. And as I talked about last week, if 2 homosexual people to get together, they're going to stay alone. They're not going to be, there's no children that are going to be produced. If you go back and read Genesis 1 and 2, it's obvious that when God gave Eve to Adam, it was the idea that they would be fruitful and multiply. In fact, once he put them together, they were going to be fruitful and multiply. They'd have to avoid each other if they didn't want to be fruitful and multiply. So in his introduction, I went back and copied that wording here. He had said earlier on, just to offer a brief outline for this presentation, I'll start by considering some of the broader issues and divisions that are behind this debate. So in other words, I'm not really getting to the debate yet. I'm just considering some of the broader issues and divisions that are behind this debate. But believe me, his argument is working. In fact, if you are with him, if you're in agreement with him, by the time he gets to that point we just stopped, minute 16, verse or second 45, the end of his introduction, if you're with him at that point, you're absolutely going to cave on the rest, because all he's got to do is plant doubt in your mind. Because here's the way I wrote these down. Here's how he's built his introduction. Number 1, he uses phrases like the ordination of gay clergy and the blessing of same-sex unions without defining or justifying the terms. He says that we're divided over these things. Well, who even says they're things? There's nothing biblical about the ordination of gay clergy. That's not a biblical phrase. The blessing of same-sex unions, that's not a biblical phrase. That's what he's supposed to be proving in this video. And yet he's starting off saying, well, okay, in the church, some of us are for this and some of us are against it. No, there's not even a thing. Secondly, he uses phrases like acceptance, inclusion, and love versus sexual purity and holiness. So he's defined anyone who disagrees with him as being interested in sexual purity and holiness, but not interested in acceptance, inclusion, and love, as if those things are mutually exclusive. Anyone who cares about sexual purity and holiness can't care about acceptance, inclusion, and love. So he's basically hijacked those terms for use in his argument. In other words, if you agree with me, then you're for acceptance, inclusion, and love. If you disagree with me, then you're against acceptance, you're against inclusion, you're against love. And this is the way it so often happens in political discourse, is one side will commandeer the language, and therefore anyone who disagrees with them is automatically wrong just for disagreeing with them. You see this happen all the time when they talk about reform. Political discussions, they'll talk about healthcare reform or immigration reform. If you can get whatever your idea is called reform, then anybody who's against you is against reform. Well, that might not be true at all, because whatever you want to do for healthcare or immigration might be worse than what we have right now. But you got to call it reform, so that meant yours is improving things. And anybody who's against that's against improvement. It's a very effective political and rhetorical trick, but it's very, very misleading. Another thing he says in his introduction we saw was that there's only 6 verses out of 31,000. 6 verses out of 31,000. Wow. How could the Bible really be against homosexuality if there's only 6 verses out of 31,000? Well, that's something that if you think about for a second, it makes sense. But if you think about it for longer than a second, you realize it's inane. I think you heard him say there at the end, 3 in the Old Testament, 3 in the New Testament. Well, most people today think, well, the Old Testament, that's passe. That's, you got to eat kosher, and we know Jesus relieved us from that. So already you're down to 3 verses out of 31,000. So like I say, if you're not up in arms with Matthew, by the time he gets through with his introduction, you're a sucker. You're gone. He's completely won you over. Next, he defines everyone as either gay or straight according to their sexual orientation. These are not biblical terms. Who agreed to that? I don't think we're born gay or straight. There's nothing in the Bible about that. He's supposed to be presenting a biblical defense for his position. That's the whole way his video is framed. An alternative biblical interpretation. Well, where is he getting that from the Bible? What interpretation of the Bible tells you that everybody's either gay or straight? He talks also about the equality of loving relationships. Well, who equated them? Who said that a homosexual relationship is equally loving to a marriage? That's not in the Bible. He's getting that from somewhere else. And then, as I've said a number of times, he personalizes it all himself. In other words, the traditional teaching is restricting my life, and I want what I want. And if you're against me, then you're against me being happy, you're against acceptance, you're against inclusion, you're against love. And then these 2 big things where he says that anybody who thinks that homosexuality is a sin is against the Sermon on the Mount, against Genesis 1 and 2. But in so doing, he himself is anti-biblical. So in all these ways, he's been arguing for his position throughout the entire introduction, where he was just going to offer a brief outline and consider some of the broader issues and divisions that are behind this debate. So, my purpose was he's obviously influencing a lot of people. A lot of people are hearing him. Let's see how many views he's had. 966,679. How many views have my video reviews of his had? Last time I checked, it was less than 10. It was like 8. So now I have more people than that who read my blogs and who listen to my podcast. Not a whole lot more. Right now, somewhere between, I shouldn't say right now. The last time I checked, there were between, say, 75 and 125 people a day who listen to the podcast, and about that same number, a little bit more, who read the blog. So it's still not big numbers. He's reaching a lot more people. And as I say, I think his argument is very rhetorically effective. He presents it as a biblical interpretation. It's not a biblical interpretation. It's a biblical interpretation that's an anti-biblical message. His message is against the Bible in so many ways. It's pro-homosexual. The Bible's against homosexuality. It believes it's a sin. He says that any teaching that makes, well, I've already talked about that we don't need to go over that again. He's hypocritical when he presents it, because he's not recognizing that if his interpretation gets accepted, it's just going to make different people feel bad. It's not like it's going to make everybody feel good. I have sympathy for him. He didn't get to this frame of mind by himself. A lot of people led him to it by their own actions. Our society in general has. But, whether it's Matthew or whether it's this subject or any other subject, recognize that it's not enough for someone to say that what they're teaching is biblical or according to the Bible or Christian. It's got to truly be biblical. It's got to truly come from God. And just because someone says they're from God, says that they're going by the Bible, and they're nice looking and they have nice manners, that doesn't mean that they're from God. That doesn't mean that they're telling you the truth. So look for the truth. As it says in Psalm 119, thy word is truth. Live for God, live for the truth, and don't be deceived by smooth talkers. God bless you.